Then John Kohlenberger discusses some of the controversies surrounding Bible translations. Now, author Robert Barsky discusses his book, Noam Chomsky, A Life of Dissent. The book examines Chomsky's ideas about education and politics. Robert Barsky is an English professor at the University of Western Ontario. He spoke to an organization called the Chomsky Group, which meets regularly at Vertigo Books in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming to today's meeting of the Noam Chomsky Reading Group. We are a book club who meet monthly here at Vertigo Books in order to discuss the life and political work of Noam Chomsky. Vertigo Books is located at 1337 Connecticut Avenue Northwest in Washington, D.C. The phone number is 202-429-9272. Please call the store for further information about our forthcoming events. All of our events are free and open to the public. Today we're honored and pleased to have with us Professor Robert Barsky, Professor of English at the University of Western Ontario in Canada. Robert is the author of Introduction to Literary Theory, Constructing a Productive Other, Discourse Theory, and the Convention Refugee Hearing, co-editor with Michael Holquist of Bakhtin and Otherness, and author of most interest to us, most recently, of Noam Chomsky, A Life in Dissent, a political biography just published by MIT Press. We are very glad to have Robert with us today to share with us the fruits of his research into the intellectual origins and background of Noam Chomsky's political work. Thank you, Robert, for coming. The format today will consist of a brief initial presentation by Robert, followed by our usual informal discussion. And there's free coffee and cookies here for anybody interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very, very much for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you amongst people who know his work, the work of Noam Chomsky, so well, and who have been debating it for so long. In a sense, my contribution and my interests represent but a small area of Chomsky's work. I have been, over the last years, concerned with the milieus, particularly the early milieus that were formative for Chomsky in terms of both his politics and his linguistics. In that sense, Noam Chomsky, A Life of Dissent, speaks very much to these early milieus, and with a sense that I have that so much of what Chomsky is referring to from these milieus, and I'll talk about a couple of them, remain useful for an understanding of contemporary society. So the two groups, or the two individuals that I'd like to refer to whom I will refer today, are two of the groups, two individuals I take to be extremely important in terms of these early milieus, Zelig Harris and Rudolf Rocker. So let me read this, and then we shall have a talk about their continued implications. One of the principal claims that I make in Noam Chomsky, A Life of Dissent, is that a whole corpus of knowledge that's useful for discussions about and evaluations of contemporary society are unknown to the majority, if not the vast majority, of society. There may very well be reasons for this, including conscious attempts on the part of peoples variously empowered to harp on weak alternatives to the present-day capitalist societies in order to avoid the serious issues raised by more valuable criticisms and proposals. It seems likely, therefore, that those who uphold the status quo find unquestionable legitimation when they compare their actions to the likes of dictators and so forth. It was, of course, particularly fortuitous that Lenin and Stalin and the whole Bolshevik party came to bear the label of Marxist or communist, despite the fact that their actions bore virtually no resemblance to either Marxism or communism as envisioned by Marx and various supporters of communism. The stronger versions of either Marxism or communism, such as the anti-Bolshevik variety or the Council Communists, are seldom, if ever, discussed in the contemporary world. Another contention that I'd like to put forth today is that Noam Chomsky's political, and to some degree his linguistic and philosophical works as well, owe a significant debt to what Chomsky calls classical liberals, and also to anarchists, socialists, and anti-Bolshevik Marxists, and indeed that his work serves as a valuable gateway into the analyses provided thereby. A whole series of figures can be discussed in this regard, from Panikkot to Kropotkin, from Paul Matic to Godwin. But the figures I'd like to recall today are, as I mentioned, Rudolf Rocker, in particular from his monumental tome Nationalism and Culture, and Zelig Harris, and here with regards to his equally monumental tome, which is due to be released any time now, called The Transformation of Capitalist Society, that was published by Rowman Littlefield. Let me begin with the Harris book. The question that underwrites this fascinating study is how, in a period of firmly entrenched capitalism, which is intrinsically exclusionary, but remarkably adapted to the pressures of cyclical downturns, and of course firmly protected by ruling class interests, can we hope for a transformation of capitalist society? Harris's approach, informed by works by figures such as Karl Korsch, Karl Marx, Paul Matic, Anton Pannekow, and by movements such as the Mondragon Group, the Council Communists, the Kibbutzim, points to a non-political, non-violent potential that might grow out of existing and possibly increasing tendencies within contemporary capitalism itself. This movement is towards accelerating the establishment of what is called ESOPs, that is, employee share ownership plans, and more generally, a gradual growth of employee ownership and control. Allow me to emphasize here the non-violent and almost spontaneous nature of this transformation that Harris is referring to as one way of distinguishing it from, say, a state socialist project, which involves the kind of state direction, if not oppression, upheld by the figures about whom we know too much or not enough, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and so forth. According to Harris in this book, a transformation of capitalist society is necessary for several reasons. First, quote, the large and getting larger unemployed and impoverished segment of the population is excluded from the benefits of capitalist production and society, end quote. Second, capitalism necessarily requires profit-making and profit maximizing for, quote, an ever-expanding domain of operation, an expansion that cannot be maintained forever. And third, says Harris, the Earth's resources are undergoing destruction at an alarming rate. This transformation, according to Harris, could occur because cyclical economic downturns that occur regularly in contemporary society and the inherent unprofitability of certain sectors of the economy leave open spaces for enhanced employee participation. So Harris's book looks forward, quote, to a time when the decline of capitalist production in various countries, economic sectors, and companies leaves workers without job prospects and sectors of production inadequately covered for the needs of the population. In Harris's view, these circumstances are appropriate for a situation whereby employees could be, quote, included in sharing control, and then, by virtue of the changed attitudes of workers and their newfound understanding of the socioeconomic situation, these same workers could develop new attitudes, thus paving the way for a more humane and equitable society. Okay, this is basically what Harris discusses in this book. Chomsky does not share Harris's optimism about ESOPs. Aesopes, in Chomsky's view, often work for a very short period of time, and then once a company becomes profitable again, it is either sold to a normal corporation or dissolved with the employees taking the windfall. Further, the idea that this experience of cooperating in a commonly owned enterprise could change attitudes is, for Chomsky, perhaps a somewhat unduly optimistic, and is not necessarily borne out by the experiences that we've had with existing Aesops. Nevertheless, I think that one can easily detect similarities between this text, at least in terms of fundamental values and approach, and with many texts, and with the fundamental values and approach of Noam Chomsky. The second figure that I'd like to recall is Rudolf Rocker. When we look to the major hypotheses proposed in Rocker's work, some, I think, critically important similarities emerge. An interesting case in point is Rocker's view of liberalism, as described in Nationalism and Culture. We're now, I think, probably familiar with Chomsky's frequent references to the writing of Humboldt or Locke and his frequently repeated statement that there exists a kind of red thread linking what he calls classical liberalism, right, which is what Rocker calls liberalism, to certain strains of anarchism. This link, says Chomsky, was suggested to him early on in the course of his reading works by Rocker. To put it simply, Rocker shared with upholders of liberalism a belief that, quote, the continuous guardianship of the state has been just as detrimental to the fruitful development of all creative forces in society as the guardianship of the church had been in previous centuries. Absolute freedom from all sources of oppression and power, the church in earlier states and the state today, is a constant theme in Rocker's work because, says Rocker, only in freedom does there arise in man the consciousness of responsibility for his acts and regard for the rights of others. Only in freedom can there unfold in its full strength that most precious of social instincts, man's sympathy for the joys and sorrows of his fellow man, and the resultant impulse towards mutual aid in which are rooted all social ethics and all ideas of social justice. Notice that this implies the idea that there exists in man a kind of innate evil, is just about thoroughly discounted in Rocker's work, and I must say in Chomsky's as well. That the state should not interfere with the lives of individuals is, of course, only half the story, as told by either Rocker or Chomsky. The other half is the exploration of individual and collective potential through this freedom. And indeed, one half can become a measurement of the other, as is illustrated in Rocker's reference to what he calls the ancient wisdom of Protagoras, which he uses to bolster his own support for liberalism. Rocker finds in Protagoras' doctrine an evaluation of the social environment that is based upon an assessment of, quote, whether it furthers the natural development of the individual or is a hindrance to his personal freedom and independence. Its conceptions of society are those of an organic process resulting from man's natural necessities and leading to free associations, which exist as long as they fulfill their purpose and dissolve again when this purpose has become meaningless. I think that's a really nice statement of the kind of society that's envisioned both by Rocker and also by Chomsky. And it also, I think, it makes an important link between anarchism's refusal of all forms of authority and liberalism's belief, at least is this version of liberalism's belief, that, quote, government in certain matters cannot be disposed with. This sounds, of course, a bit like a contradiction until we note with Rocker that this form of liberalism upholds a belief that the state, quote, had a right to exist only as long as its functionaries strove to protect the personal safety of its citizens against forcible attacks. Okay, so what about a Marxist state then? If we're talking about the powers that a state can have to protect the interests of an individual, why not turn towards a Marxist state? Well, Chomsky agrees with Rocker once again on this point, that anarchism, as they describe it, is a much more serious alternative to contemporary society than most Marxisms, for reasons that were described by Rocker almost 60 years ago, when he wrote that, quote, communism is to be taken as merely a name for the present Russian system of government which is as far removed from the original meaning of communism as a socialist system of economic equality as is every other system of government. For instance, in Nationalism and Culture, Rocker notes that this famous dictatorship of the proletarian, one of the cornerstones, of course, of the manifesto, and a legitimating notion for the Bolshevik Party at the time, remains a dictatorship. A Marxist state, says Rocker, is still a state, and a Bolshevik Party, even in its earliest manifestations, was always comprised of elites whose interests were in maintaining a totalitarian hold over the vast majority of the citizens of the USSR. But Rocker's critique of Marx goes much further, sometimes right into the writings of Marx himself. Citing Marx's famous line that the philosophers have variously interpreted the world and now it is time to change it, Rocker comments that Marx himself did nothing during his whole life that followed this precept except to reinterpret the world and its history. Says Rocker, Marx analyzed capitalistic society in his way and showed a great deal of intellect and enormous learning in doing so. But Proudhon's creative power was denied him. He was and remained an analyst, a brilliant and learned analyst, but nothing else. That Marx was but a powerful theorist of capitalism is something that has been noted frequently in various milieus. But Rocker finds in Marx's work something that's downright nefarious and limiting when he suggests that, quote, Marx enmeshed the minds of his followers in the fine network of a cunning dialectic which sees in history hardly anything but economics and obstructs even every deeper insight into the world of social events. This, I think, is a stunning condemnation, which is worth looking into. For the moment, though, it's worth recalling Chomsky's own activism and his own dislike for what he calls Marxology and the over-theorization of the social world. At the heart of Rocker's condemnation of Marx was, as well, a sense that the transformation of capitalist society would not occur as Marx had predicted. For Marx, the transformational stage was to be a dictatorship of the proletariat, a notion that Rocker calls idle. History, says Rocker, knows no such transitions. There exist solely more primitive and more complicated forms in the various evolutionary phases of social progress. Furthermore, the effort to inflict a transformation upon a people in the name of Marxist idealism is for Rocker a tyranny like any other. In the epilogue to Marxism and Nationalism, written after World War II, Rocker notes that, quote, if the Russian example taught us anything, it is only the fact that socialism without political, social, and spiritual freedom is inconceivable and must lead to unlimited despotism, uninfluenced in its callousness by any ethical restraints. This was clearly recognized by Proudhon when almost 100 years ago he said that an alliance of socialism with absolutism would produce the worst tyranny of all times. Quite a prediction. So this, I think, leads us to the heart of Rocker's and Chomsky's work on anarchism and to the assumptions that lie behind it, as described by, for example, Proudhon. The first step, of course, is to dismantle the present state of the nation, because, says Rocker, behind everything national stands the will to power of small minorities and the special interests of the caste and class in the state. For Rocker, all nationalism, quote, is reactionary in nature, for it strives to enforce on the separate parts of the great human family a definite character, according to a preconceived idea. In this respect, too, it shows the interrelationship of nationalistic ideology with the creed of every revealed religion, says Rocker. Indeed, says Rocker, national states are political church organizations. The so-called national consciousness is not born into man, it is trained into him. It is a religious concept. One is a German, a Frenchman, an Italian, just as one is a Catholic, a Protestant, or a Jew. Notice that the urgency of Rocker's political context had him writing specifically about the natures of nationalism, right? Chomsky speaks to quite a different world when he describes, for example, the manufacture of consent, since it's a different kind of nationalism, perhaps one more strongly linked to corporatism that is described in his work. Nevertheless, I think that the link is there. But how, without a state, does one form the kind of communities, the loose affiliations of workers and peoples that Chomsky and Rocker, and if you wish, Harris, favor in their discussions of what a good society should look like. And on a more emotive level, what does one do with the human being's natural and indeed healthy attachment to home, to family, to communities? Rocker here makes a critical distinction, seldom discussed or even raised in discussions of nationalism, between home and state, which helps clarify this while providing further applicability, I think, to the program that he is describing. Rocker claims that the home sentiment, an attachment to that spot of land on which a man has spent the years of his youth, is deeply intergrown with the profoundest of feelings. Indeed, says Rocker, early impressions of home are most permanent and have the more lasting impression on his soul. They can even bring in later years some yearning after a past long buried under ruins and offer the romantic the means to look so deeply within. So this vision that Rocker is describing is therefore not to be confused with the kind of flag waving or sentimentality invoking that the state undertakes in an effort to get them and get people attached to the state as opposed to the home. Indeed, says Rocker, the attempt to replace man's natural attachment to the home by a dutiful love of the state, a structure which owes its creation to all sorts of actions, and in which, with brutal force, elements have been welded together that have no necessary connection, is perhaps one of the most grotesque phenomena of our time. This state fanaticism, which has come to replace, in Rocker's view, religious fanaticism, has become, according to Rocker, the greatest obstacle to cultural development. Now, the kind of cultural development to which Rocker refers in this assertion includes, I think, creative production in the broadest sense. An upshot of unfettering human beings is that their creative abilities thereby are allowed to flourish. Under state-directed oppression, human relationships are, according to Rocker, perverted. Says Rocker, the shocking inequality of human conditions, and above all the state, which bred the monopoly whose festering cancerous growth has destroyed the fine tissue of social relationships. This attempt to describe human relationships as kind of organic falls into line, I think, with Chomsky's sense of how the preciousness of human community and relationships, and how one must act to promote these relationships. The anarchist society hereby imagined would allow all persons to explore the innate qualities with which each is endowed. The innate qualities that are also, and this is an interesting link to the linguistics, the object of his search as regards linguistics. For someone interested in this kind of discussion of anarchism, one of the clearest descriptions of the anarchist society as described by Rocker and by Chomsky is to be found in a short book called Anarchism and Anarcho-Syndicalism. Herein, Rocker advocates, quote, the abolition of economic monopolies and of all political and social coercive institutions within society. In their place, Rocker suggests that there should exist a free association of all productive forces based upon cooperative labor, which would have for its sole purpose the satisfying of the necessary requirements of every member of society. With his hatred of nationalism, one can imagine as well that Rocker would propose a replacement for the state apparatus. And indeed, he suggests that, quote, in place of the present national states, with their lifeless machinery of political and bureaucratic institutions, anarchists desire a federation of free communities which shall be bound to one another by their common economic and social interests and arrange their affairs by mutual agreement and free contract. Okay. Chomsky's own words indicate the relationship between his own approach and the one advocated in this very text by Rudolf Rocker. In the recent book, Powers and Prospects, Chomsky writes that, quote, my personal visions are fairly traditional anarchist ones, with origins in the Enlightenment and classical liberalism of the type that I described earlier on. This version of classical liberalism is what Chomsky calls, quote, the original, before it was broken on the rocks of rising industrial capitalism, as Rudolf Rocker put it in his work on anarcho-syndicalism 60 years ago. Broken, and perhaps as well forgotten. So the final question I'd like to address then is, if, as I am suggesting, Rocker and Harris are critical for an understanding both of Chomsky's own work, but also of what one can do in society even now. How does one gain access to this material? Where does one learn about it, and so forth? This is no small matter, since this is far from being mainstream kind of work. Well, one of the tools that has been set up in association with this book is a website. MIT Press Digital Lab set up a website which allows you not only to read the entire text of the book on the web, but also allows you, when you come across something that is unfamiliar to you, like, for example, if it were Rocker or Paul Maddock or Council Communism or something, allows you to click on that area, and you will be sent off to a site which describes how exactly this whole world would work. This is, I think, an interesting use of the web. So, as I said, the entire book is present, and various areas that I had imagined would be relatively unknown to people are then hooked in thanks to the net. Furthermore, we've set up an interactive laboratory which allows people, through the genius of the press, to come through and discuss issues such as, well, how would anarcho-syndicalism work today, and what is the relationship between left Zionism, which you describe heavily, and contemporary problems in Israel? Those kinds of questions are raised in the laboratory. And finally, there's another section which discusses specifically the work of Zelig Harris and its relationship to Noam Chomsky, and also its own context and world, something that I'm working on for future research. So just to name it, it's www.mitpress.mit.edu/Chomsky. So this is the beginning of an answer to the question, how do we gain access to the work that could be deemed to be extremely important for an understanding of Chomsky's work and also for an understanding of contemporary society? I'd be happy to entertain questions. Sure. www.mitpress.edu/Chomsky. And this was Ben Williams and Marnie Smith and the Digital Lab and so forth, who are regulating this, will and set it up. You can either make comments to them or else directly to me via the site. So I'd be happy to entertain questions.
So this ends Robert's formal presentation. Again, we'd like to thank him for coming, and as he says now, he'll be glad to take questions from any of you. Please, let's proceed informally, just as if C-SPAN were not here. I'd like to remind you that we have free coffee and cookies here.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I missed most of your presentation, but speaking of the web, have you had any chance to use online archives like Spunk Press? Are you familiar with that?
Some of the online archives have been linked up to the site. If there are others that are not there, we'd certainly like to know about them. I've certainly used some of them, yes.
Okay, because I'm a librarian with it. It's an online anarchist archive, and we're putting all the classics online.
Stunning. Well, then
and essays and everything international.
Okay, well, if it's not already hooked up, we would certainly look into doing that. Thank you.
I suggest you check it out.
Okay. Yes.
You mentioned the connection between left Zionism and current developments in Israel on the website. Could you just say a couple words about that now?
Sure. It was I think that the experience of writing the whole book was an experience of discovering many materials that have not been spoken of, either in kind of mainstream milieus or in university or anything else. And I think that the left Zionism was of particular interest and concern for a number of reasons. First of all, to understand the context out of which Chomsky is coming. That is, he comes out of his childhood and so forth. He comes out of a left Zionist background. Secondly, to try and situate the attacks that have been made upon Chomsky by contemporary Zionists, and to try and understand what their relationship is to previous manifestations of Zionism. So that was a second reason for the interest. The third reason is that I think that a lot of what was being talked about by, for example, Zelig Harris in his work for Avuka and Left Zionists remains interesting even in the present context. And certainly as soon as Israel became a religious state, the basic precepts for the kinds of left Zionists that I'm describing were undercut. What they were interested in was the basis of the state was to be socialist and not religious. So, but on the other hand, I think that by looking back to the documents and by looking back to what it is that was envisioned for then Palestine, what was interesting, I think, was that what was proposed was that the Arabs and the Jews had equally suffered under various forms of oppression, and therefore it would have been logical for them to unite and work together, not against each other, but against various forces of imperialist or religious oppression. So I think that even though it doesn't speak specifically to today's Israeli context, it does speak to an interesting way of rethinking this whole problem. Anything else? Yeah.
Perhaps revealing my own ignorance of anarchist theory, but in Chomsky's work or Rudolf Rocker's or anybody else's, what is the democratic means by which the kind of society they envision can be achieved, and by which illegitimate force and hierarchy can be contained or avoided?
There are a few points that are raised in the discussion of the transformation towards anarchist society. One of which is that the process, the so-called process, is, when described by Chomsky, generally a kind of spontaneous uprising. There's no sense that there should be a vanguard that would direct and say, well, this is the way that the anarchist society should look. In his sense, and I think that this is also in Rocker, there's a kind of logic and rationality and sense behind this kind of society whereby people come together and form associations around common themes or projects or concerns. So what I find intriguing about that is that there is the sense that we as a group might have a common purpose through the production of something or the pursuing of a certain cultural question or something, and that this can be undertaken informally without either a profit motive or without some other motive coming in the way. So the free association would occur. The product that you were working to develop or something could be developed without, in a sense, in an unfettered way, in a way unfettered by, for example, the constraints of profit making. And then once this was completed, if it was deemed appropriate that the association dissolved, then it would simply dissolve. So I think the whole notion of democracy and so forth, that would have to be worked out according to the different associations and according to what it is that people were working on. But there's no, I don't think there's any Bible that one would read to see get a sense.
Is that an awful optimistic and perhaps unrealistic view of human nature to think that could work?
This is the most frequently expressed, I think, problem with the anarcho-syndicalism, anarchism, even anti-Bolshevik Marxist models. As I pointed out in here, one of the notions that's taken for granted in Rocker, and that was why that passage is sort of interesting in his work, is that when people are freed of oppressive forces and are not forced by the profit motive and so forth, that the whole attitudes towards one another and so forth is necessarily going to change. And that's one point. The second point is, and I think that Chomsky shares this quite strongly, is that human nature is not, I don't think in their sense, defined by its maliciousness or desire to tyrannize or something, but more by an incredible creative ability and so forth. And since in the world that they describe, which has in some manifestations existed, for example, in Spain in the 30s, you have the possibility of not just living a life that's far more enriched and so forth, but also of moving forward in all sorts of areas, be they industrial or cultural or whatever else.
Going to implement this all over the world at the same time. I mean, for instance, China, with 1 billion people there, and I and uneducated, many of them uneducated. I don't know how this would be possible to implement at the same time.
You mean that the problems that these kinds of communities would pose in Western civilization versus in other areas such as China? That is, that there would be different problems posed in different countries and areas?
Well, I don't know. I don't know.
I think that one of Chomsky's own points is that the system as it exists now requires such a massive, if you wish, policing and such a massive intervention on the part of a small elite to maintain their power, that we are perhaps given the very illusory sense that this system is somehow working and that it somehow accords with basic needs or something. But it's, you know, and the massive studies that he does indicates everything that, you know, quite the contrary, in fact. So that's one point I think to be said. The other point is, of course, in various areas of the world, the problems that are to be faced and the kinds of free associations that would need to be set up and elaborated and so forth would vary, and the obstacles that they would face and so forth would vary from time to time and from place to place. I don't think that there's a kind of, again, in response to your question, I don't think that there's a kind of global vision of, you know, this is the appropriate way for a free association to look. That is going to take its own course based upon the interests of indigenous groups and social groups and of various sorts at various times.
The model of free association and spontaneous democracy that you were talking about, Chomsky talks about, it seems to be in contradiction, in slight contradiction with the global forces, globalization, global media, U.S. foreign policy, other issues that he also talks about that are really beyond the power of local communities to combat. How do you reconcile that contradiction?
That's I think a critical point as well, because it speaks not so much to the way that the society will look subsequent to transformation, if this were to occur, but the obstacles that those who are interested in the transformation of society towards a far more equal, or a far more open and free society are going to face. The interests of these so-called world economy with these so-called world organizations and so forth are obviously going to be put into massive question by such movements, and therefore I think that what you're speaking to is very much the problem of the transformation towards something freer. In this sense, I find Harris's book fascinating, to tell you the truth, because what he is suggesting in the transformation of capitalist society is that this movement will occur within the present-day capitalism, and that the contradictions of capitalism and the cyclical downturns of capitalism and the areas of unprofitability that exist presently in capitalism, for example, open up the spaces for the possibility of the elaboration of small groups of this sort. Now, what Harris, I think, assumes is that once this occurs, workers will be unwilling to go back into the normal corporatist work world and will recognize the advantages of this kind of system. And again, as I mentioned, Chomsky, I think, is somewhat less certain it's going to occur in this way. But what I think is compelling about Harris's work is that it does at least give you some sense of how you're going to move towards another form of ownership of property, at least, and then globalization, or whatever one would call it, the ability to transmit information and use products from various parts of the world, that could only be advantageous to a world of free association. It could only be a good thing. The problem is getting there. Yes.
May I please ask you to elaborate on the view of human nature presupposed by Chomsky's linguistics and the view of human nature that you've just spoken about, that his theories of society are based on?
Here, I think there have been all sorts of discussions about the incompatibility between the scientific work and more specifically the view of human nature proposed in the linguistic work and that which Chomsky proposes. I myself don't see such a strong contradiction, because what one sees in, for example, his contemporary work in the minimalist program is the sense that there are fundamental and basic and innate qualities to human beings which characterize us as human beings. And the compatibility between the projects, the linguistic and the political, is, in a sense, if you ask the question, how best allow these innate abilities, which turn out to be creative, and as I said, certainly not malicious in the way that they're often described, how best allow them to thrive? And there you'd say, well, what seems most appropriate for the human being to manifest this kind of creativity is the kind of society that he's describing. So, in other words, I don't think there to be a contradiction between the two. I think, in fact, that one of them is a scientific endeavor to understand what the nature of the brain is, or what the nature of the language faculty is. What does it look like? And we're not going to be able to change that. That's the way it is. That's the way we were born. That's why we don't have feathers or whatever else. I mean, it's fundamental. And then that's the first. That's an object of study. The other object is, and this is again in perfect consistency with, for example, many of the classical liberal theorists, how do we best allow those creative abilities, or whatever those fundamental abilities are, to flourish? Yes.
Me again. I saw the review of your book in the Washington Post.
Yes.
Which, as I recall, basically took you to task for not being more critical of Chomsky.
Yes.
Do you have anything, a response to that review?
I received a whole series of letters from people based on that review. People who wrote to the person who wrote the review and so forth and so on. One of the points that was made was that had this been a biography of Kennedy, and had I spoken with admiration, the review probably wouldn't have read the same way. I think that there's something to that. The second point, the second way to look at this is that I am not going to pretend that that this is a critical study, but I'm also critical in the sense of critiquing Chomsky, because I ostensibly do think that the work that he has undertaken is fundamental, worth knowing, worth understanding, and that many of these so-called awful things that Chomsky has been engaged in the folie-sans business and so forth, which this reviewer mentions, are, I think, unjustly and unduly discussed. And it's not so much that I'm dismissive of them; I do discuss them, but I don't think that they warrant the kind of attention that his basic project warrants. So that would be my. He did point out that the early milieu work is documented in there and in useful ways, and there I very much agree with him. So in a sense, that he thinks that I agree with Chomsky, well, that's fine. That he thinks that this is a view of Chomsky that is positive, well, that's true. That he thinks I'm an apologist, that's wrong. I simply looked at the material and think that in what is described as being Chomsky's great flaws and so forth, I just don't see anything really that substantial, to tell you the truth. And again, if this would have been Kennedy, I think he'd have been, I imagine, quite differently received.
You mentioned how Chomsky has discussed some issues that are not very hot topics for research, and the links between classical liberalism and anarchism was the one I think you mentioned.
Yes.
Has there been, is there a Chomsky school? Are there any other, besides yourself, are there any other researchers in the field of political science or philosophy or political economy that have followed in his footsteps and chosen to research the topics that he has introduced or highlighted?
One of the pleasures, I think, of reading Chomsky is the wealth of footnotes and the references to all sorts of names which you go to the bookstore and you find out that it's been out of print for 25 years and you have to chase it down. In a lot of cases, these books turn out to do the kind of research that Chomsky is suggesting. As regards, so I think that one of the best sources of this kind of historical knowledge is Chomsky himself, whether it be on the Spanish Civil War, whether it be on the Middle East, or whether it be on contemporary American politics. There's a wealth of information in every one of Chomsky's books. It's a pleasure to read it in that sense. In the early milieus that I describe, Seymour Melman, and those people who were around Zelig Harris, I think of Melman as being a particularly interesting example. There's also that, I think, tendency. And then in the people who are discussing Chomsky, that is, in the people who can enlighten us about where the interesting references are, certainly what Otero has been doing over these years is, I think, remarkably useful and interesting. There are many more. Well, allow me to thank you, and if you are at all intrigued by the Harris milieus or the early milieus or anything of that nature, knowledgeable of, and would like to know more about, all of these things are something that is ongoing in my own work, and I'd be happy to engage in further discussion. So thank you very, very much for coming.
It's great. It's going to be on C-SPAN.
Always on that.
In a minute, book editors specializing in nonfiction talk about their work and offer advice to authors on getting published. And later, a discussion of some of the controversies surrounding Bible translations.